So
Okay.
let's talk a little bit about your history and the Earth's climate history. Um, my general theme is that the entire green movement is an attempt to stop the Earth from warming to its pre-meteor temperatures, which, if you say it like that, it points out the foolishness of their argument. But if I say it, I'm not a professor. Uh,
Well, I'm a professor, and even a lot of people don't believe me. So it's this is part of it. That people have such fixed opinions about something they know nothing about. It's an amazing world.
yeah, you're not kidding.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. So you want to go into a background on me?
Yeah, a quick little background.
Okay.
I've done a little research, but the audience hasn't.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I came to Canada from England when I was a young man, at 18 years old, and gave me the opportunities I couldn't do in socialist England, although Canada's socialist, but not quite as bad. And I joined the Canadian Air Force, and I flew 4 years of anti-submarine work in the North Atlantic, chasing Russian submarines around. Nobody ever told us what to do if we caught one. And I was operations officer of a squadron during the Cuban crisis, so know an awful lot about that. But then after that, did 5 years of search and rescue flying in the Arctic of Canada. And after all of that, I ended up with a problem that I think needs much more attention than the world's giving it, and that's noise pollution, because I had a hearing loss from flying without proper hearing protection. And when I see these kids with the earpieces in and I can hear it across the street, I know what damage they're doing. And by the way, to give you an idea, when I went to the Aviation Medicine Institute, they looked at my audiogram and told me which airplanes I'd been flying by which frequencies were missing. That's how that's how bad it is. But anyway, I took a very small cash settlement from the military and went back to university to study this problem of why weather forecasting was so bad. And I looked at it. It hadn't improved in 150 years, and they still can't forecast with any degree of accuracy beyond 72 hours. And of course, and yet here they were telling the world that they were absolutely certain that it was going to be warmer 50 years from now. And so that troubled me, and so I decided to get in there and do a doctoral thesis on climate and climate change. And by the way, when I started out, global cooling was the consensus. And to give you an idea of how much it was a consensus and how much it gripped people, I'll read. I get a quote here. If I can find it. Just hang on a second. Um, oh dear. Should have been better prepared.
Don't worry about it.
Anyway, as I said, global cooling was the consensus at that time, and I was as opposed to the arguments of global cooling consensus as I later became about the global warming consensus, because one of the things I learned was I went to England and I worked with Hubert Lamb. And he'd had the same problem, that he was giving weather forecasts during the Second World War, and the pilots were coming back and saying, "You almost killed us. You told us it was clear skies, and we got freezing rain and icing on the wings and so on." And so he decided to look at the problem as I was, and realized that when he started looking at the historic record, that climate change was far more dramatic than anybody had ever understood, and that what we needed to do was to understand long-term climate change better. And so he started doing reconstructions of long-term climate based upon that notion. And that's what I ended up doing. I reconstructed the weather for Central North America over a 300-year period. And when you do that, you discover that the climate changes dramatically and very significantly all of the time. And so all of this panic.
I think I lost you.
This is what bothered me about it, was that it was the exploitation of science for a political agenda. And so that's really where I got started into becoming a so-called global warming skeptic initially and then denier later. So I've been studying climate both practically in the Air Force and actually giving weather forecast instructions for the crews, and then academically getting a PhD in historical climate reconstruction of past climates, and for over 40 years. And this is why I am so much attacked because, and in fact, I have 3 lawsuits against me, all by members of the United Nations IPCC. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And
Excuse me, those were the ones that were discredited for falsifying information with the climate change emails. So the people who are caught lying are the ones who are suing you.
well, three of them are members. The IPCC is actually a UN agency. The people that got caught with the leaked emails were based at the University of East Anglia, the Climatic Research Unit, and somebody there, and I think it was an inside job, but one of the things that happens is that the IPCC was an organization set up to create the science that they needed to put the argument forward that human CO2 was causing global warming. And I'll explain in a minute how that was done. But in order for their work to get publicity, it has to go through an organization called COP, which is the Conference of the Parties. And the most recent one they had was the one in Poland, where they were all saying, oh, there's 12 years left, and Ocasio-Cortez and all those 12 years left and so on. And of course, my point to her is then, why are you taking a senator's pension if there's only 12 years left? But that's part of the problem. But the COP parties, they decide how much money is going to be spent on climate change and on global warming research. But they do it on the basis of the science that the IPCC give them. The IPCC, as I said, give them predetermined science. And what I mean by that is they wanted to show that CO2 from humans was causing runaway global warming, because a group called the Club of Rome, which was set up by David Rockefeller in 1940, was it what? 46, oh, I've forgotten the year, but it doesn't matter. No, 68. He set up the Club of Rome, and with it was people like Ted Turner and all of the usual left-wing characters, not George Soros, but Michael Morris Strong and so on. And they argued that the world was overpopulated and each person was using resources, but the people burning fossil fuels were using resources at a greater rate than everybody else, and therefore they had to shut down the industrialized nations. And that was the quote from Morris Strong, that when Elaine Dewar interviewed him at the UN and said, well, what's the problem for the planet? And he said, the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? Well, the only way you can do that is that you can, it's like if you compare an industrialized nation with a car, you can stop the car engine by shutting off the fuel supply, but if you did that with a nation, there'd be immediate outcry. Or you could stop the engine of the car by plugging the exhaust. Well, if you could show that the exhaust from that industrial engine, CO2, was causing runaway global warming, then you could say, well, hey, we've got to shut down those industrialized nations. And that's what they did. And Morris Strong did 2 things. One is he set it up through the World Meteorological Organization, which is made up of all the bureaucrats from every weather office around the world. So he put the bureaucrats in charge of this. This is the biggest fake news story in history, organized and run by the deep state, the bureaucrats. And so Strong set that up through the World Meteorological Organization. The other thing is that they're limited what they could do. Everybody thinks that the IPCC, this Intergovernmental Panel, is looking at climate change in total. They're not. What they're looking at is only human causes of climate change. And this is a very important point both with this issue and with larger issues in the political realm. I used to think commissions of inquiry were brilliant vehicles because they took the politics out of an issue. That's what I thought. When I first was appointed to a commission of inquiry, I discovered the truth. And the first commission of inquiry I was appointed to many, many years ago was over dispute over a lake. And of course, nothing gets nastier than fights over water, as America's discovering. But anyway, the minister asked me if I'd serve on the commission, and I said yes, because it'll take the politics out of it. Well, what happens is the minister then goes back to his office and sits down with the bureaucrats. They write the terms of reference for the commission of inquiry. In other words, they tell them what they can look at, what they can see, and what result has got to come out of it. And the classic example of that is the biggest conspiracy theory in the world today is, you can look at it on the internet, who shot John Kennedy. And the reason for that is because Chief Justice Warren, who was in charge of the Commission of Inquiry into that, and I watched him interviewed on ABC News before he died, and they said, well, look, why didn't you look at Jack Ruby and the mafia connection in Dallas? And he just very calmly said, it wasn't in my terms of reference. I knew exactly what he was saying, but most people didn't know. What he was saying was, hey, I wasn't allowed to go there. And that's exactly what Strong did when he directed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He said, only look at human causes of climate change. Well, just to give you an example of how that translates into science, there are three major greenhouse gases: methane, CO2, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. Humans, methane is about 0.05% of the total greenhouse. It's inconsequential. CO2 is only 4% of the total greenhouse gases. Water vapor is 95% of the greenhouse effect. Yet nobody knows that because the IPCC are only looking at CO2. And you say, well, don't humans put water vapor in the air? I see the steam going up. Yeah, but what they said was the amount humans produce is so small relative to the amount that's already in the atmosphere. We'll just assume that it's a constant and we don't have to look at it. But here's the problem. You've only got to have a 2% change in water vapor in the atmosphere, and that creates more change than anything that CO2 could do. But because they've deliberately limited what they can look at, and so if you go to the IPCC, oh yeah, we're doing what we're directed to do, but the public don't know that they're only directed to look at human causes. So we end up with the biggest deception in history. And when I come along and point these things out, I'm a threat because A, they can't say I'm not qualified, and B, although they try to, you read the websites on me, oh, he's not qualified, he's a geographer and all this nonsense. And then the other thing is that I developed the ability to explain complex science things to the public, and I have a God-given ability to do that in very easy ways. I honed those skills teaching a science credit for art students in 25 years at the university. So I know exactly what the challenges are. And of course, that's part of the problem. 85% of the public are art students. Only 15% are science students. And that, by the way, became a problem in my lawsuits because all the lawyers are art students. You find a lawyer that knows anything about science, you got a problem on your hands. And Justice Scalia talked about this when a case on climate change came before him. So this is the background and the whole, really basically what went on, and this is the mess that we're in today.